everyone, and welcome to Insights on Demand. My name is Allen Davenport, and I'm the Professional Learning and Development Manager for Cambridge University Press for the Southeast Asia region, or what we here call the Asean region, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I'm really excited about this session because it really is about teaching in this special region. So in this session, we're going to find out more about the Cambridge Learner Corpus, what it is, and how it can help us, and what it tells us about learners both here in Southeast Asia and all around the world. This talk is going to showcase extensive data from ASEAN learners, what they find difficult, what's easy for them, and how we can support them. Along with this, we are going to look at how this compares with learners worldwide and explore more how you can use these insights from the Cambridge Learner Corpus in your classroom. So I know you're excited to get the information. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn off my video just for the bandwidth issues and so the recording can be more smooth. And we'll start with what is a corpus. And I can think of nobody better to explain to us what a corpus is than our very own Cambridge University Press language research team. So here is a short video that they've produced just to tell us a little bit more about what a corpus is. I hope you enjoy the video.
Imagine you had a question about language. Perhaps you could ask your friend, but what if their answer was different to yours? Maybe you could ask everyone in your town, or maybe you could ask everyone in your country. This is the basis of corpus linguistics. We analyse huge collections of language to find out how it behaves and how it works.
We use the corpus in two ways. So first, to find out how English is really used, and second, to find out the language support that our learners really need.
So we've got a huge range of things going from informal family conversations around the dinner table to academic writing, to business English, to journalism, to text messages and emails, and all this allows us to have a really detailed understanding of how English behaves in lots of different contexts.
So much has changed in the world over the last 10 years, and that includes language, so we keep checking to make sure that our syllabus and our course materials is up to date to reflect those changes.
The Cambridge Learner Corpus is an unparalleled collection of learner writing.
Made up of about 180,000 real exam candidate scripts from about 200 countries around the world.
And this analysis gives us insight into how well the students perform, but also the support they need to improve.
We use the corpus to supply the language that learners need to fulfil their ambitions and potential.
So, as we heard in the video, a corpus is basically just a huge collection of text that we can analyze and find out how language behaves. It's about data and it's about evidence. And we use it to check and validate our intuitions and to find out new things about learners that perhaps we didn't know or didn't know for sure. When I like to think about why corpus why it's so exciting for me, it kind of shows us what language is like out in the wild. I mean, we get examples as teachers as classroom language, and we have our ideas in our head about how language works, but the corpus with its data and its insights, it really lets us know what's happening out there in the real world. It's the difference between, like I said, an animal in a zoo and an animal in the wild. The corpus lets us, it's like seeing the animals in the wild. I just love it so much. And the Cambridge Learner Corpus specifically is the world's largest collection of texts written by people learning English. It's made up of student responses to the writing sections of Cambridge English exams. The project has been running for over 20 years, and new texts are being added every day. And it tells us what learners can do at each stage of their learning journey. It's really exciting stuff. The Cambridge Learner Corpus is unique because of its size, but it's also unique because of its what we call the annotation scheme. The exam scripts in the corpus have been error coded. What this means is that a team of specialists have looked through each text, and if they found an error, they've annotated it. They've put a little code with computer readable tags. And this means that that corpus can easily be searched to find out where learners are successful in their use of English and where they typically struggle. And because we know lots of information about the students, like what language they speak, where they're from, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here all the information that we have based on them. It really helps us find out about how particular groups of students learn English. And this means that we can adjust our materials to spend more time on the more difficult areas. As you can see, we have learners from a huge number of language backgrounds. And we have about 2 million words of data for learners from this region, from the Southeast Asia region, across all the CEFR levels, from A1 up to the C levels. So, I mean, it's really exciting that we have so much data about our learners. And I think it'd be really interesting if we had a look in more detail. So let's do that now. What is it that we know about learners in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN learners, based on the corpus? Well, before we look at some of the negatives, let's look at the positives. What are we good at in ASEAN? What is relatively easy about learning English for ASEAN learners? Now, keep in mind that word relatively is there. There is no doubt that learning English is difficult, but there are some aspects that are easier than others. English has a lot of vocabulary which is well known internationally since it has been borrowed into other languages, especially in science and technology. Another reason why English can be easy to learn at first is it doesn't have that complicated of a morphology. That's not the case for languages like Russian or Arabic. And also, its alphabet is well known internationally compared with something like Chinese. Along with these features of English, learning English can in some ways be a simpler task than learning some other world languages, depending on your own first language. Now, many ASEAN languages are similar to English in that they also don't have grammatical gender or noun cases or extensive verb subject agreement patterns. That's not to say that they're exactly like English, but we don't have to in ASEAN think about whether a noun is masculine or feminine like I did, in Spanish. When we compare ASEAN learners with those from around the world in general, we see that, for example, ASEAN learners make relatively few word order errors in English. Now, some of you may be going, wait, my students still say car blue instead of blue car. That doesn't mean that they don't make any errors. It just means compared to other learners of English, it's not as big of a problem here in ASEAN. Also, ASEAN learners make relatively few missing preposition errors compared with some other learners. And a well-known error of missing the subject pronoun is another area that ASEAN learners are better at. Lots to be positive about. Let's have a quick look at just 4 of the countries in ASEAN in particular. We don't have time to look at all of them today, but we can see how much the corpus can just narrow down the research that we have. So again, we have about 2 million words of data for ASEAN learners across all the CEFR levels. And our research team has analyzed them. And these are some of the most characteristic things that learners in these regions find difficult. So what we've done is we've compared the local differences between nations. To highlight the differences here, we've shown a type of error for which each language has the highest number of occurrences. So, for example, learners from Thailand have the highest occurrence of missing verb errors. They're likely to say, the owner named Joey instead of the owner is named Joey. By comparison, Vietnam is highest for noun form errors. For example, plural S, they're likely to say something like, she and I are best friend instead of she and I are best friends. Moving on to Indonesia, these learners have the highest for verb form errors. So I invite you play the game instead of so I invite you to play the game. And interestingly, if we look at Malaysian learners, they're the highest for more vocabulary errors of wrong verb and wrong noun. And I hear things like this all the time when I travel to Malaysia. Things like, my mother is going to fetch us to the sports center instead of take us. And this is, of course, just a snapshot. And we know all of these error types are problematic in this region. And whatever country that you teach in, you probably know what errors your students are going to make again and again and again. And if you speak a little bit of the local language, you might even see some of the influence that that local language has on why that error is what it is. So let's have a look just a little bit wider, and let's look at what happens when we compare ASEAN learners just in general, because even though that there are differences between all of our countries in this region, there are some things that we find that whether you're in Malaysia or Indonesia or the Philippines or Thailand, that there are things that we have in common that are errors. And so the errors that we typically see are like these. Typically more than other learners around the world. And so issues with these particular examples, rather than broader categories, things like the overuse of located. My house is located on that road instead of, my house is just on that road. Or a lot of countability errors we have here. I will visit the factory to count all the equipments. Information is a word that I frequently hear, regardless of where I go around the region, become informations, or learners saying, oh, I just don't have enough vocabularies to speak English. That's some of the things we see. Some verb agreement, like it look real or it looks so real instead of it looks so real. And again, we see things with plural, I want 2 hamburger, or, she had no lesson instead of lessons. These are things that we see that are kind of distinctive to ASEAN learners. Now, if we look at grammatical errors made by ASEAN learners, some ASEAN languages don't have plural noun endings. And plural errors are an early problem for ASEAN learners. But we actually find that this resolves quickly. A more consistent problem is wrong verb tense. It doesn't resolve as quickly. It doesn't fix itself as quickly. And there are many varieties of this error, but it may be overuse of the present tense where the past tense is required. There's a lot of confusion between is and was in the region. Or it may be the use of the wrong modal verb. For example, using will instead of would, or can instead of could. It could also be an error with complicated tenses, just such as the past perfect. We find this a lot in the ASEAN region. As we said earlier, the definite article the or the can be hard to predict. So we see it either being left out a lot or overused by ASEAN learners. A lot of times they put in the where it doesn't belong. And using the wrong preposition is also a problem for our learners. And this often tends to be in part of a phrase or a chunk, which needs to be learned separately. So the things that are part of our phrases or chunks of language, our learners aren't exactly picking them up all the time, and they're substituting what prepositions may seem grammatically right to them, like at the time or at the time, when really we should just say in time, because it's part of that lexical chunk. So these are some highlighted errors that we find here in ASEAN. The second kind of error that we can look at, because it's not just grammar the corpus helps us with, the second kind of error is vocabulary errors. Vocabulary errors, let me say it clearly there, sorry. These become more prevalent for higher level learners, actually. Because as the learners don't make as many grammatical mistakes, they still tend to choose the wrong words of various types. So the most common of these wrong verbs, these can be simple light verbs used in collocation or phrase, like they say, oh, can you go to my house or come to my house? There's problems with bring versus take. Light verbs are sometimes called delexicalized verbs, things like take a shower, have a shower. Why do we say that instead of do a shower? But these collocational phrases, they can be a big problem for our learners. Also, the modal shall is sometimes overused depending where you are in ASEAN. And actually in modern standard English, shall isn't used a lot, but we see this used a lot more frequently in ASEAN learner areas, especially at the high levels. So it's actually used more frequently in ASEAN than it is even in places where English is the first language. And another common verb error that we see is the use of has instead of is, especially in a there is context. A lot of times you may hear learners say, you know, he has 15 years instead of he's 15 years old, or the tree have many apples instead of there are many apples on the tree. So these are some frequent vocabulary errors. Some more, as well as wrong verb choice, we see a lot of confusion between nouns. And this may relate to differences between the way languages partition meanings into words. What we mean there is it's more related to first language interference than just memorizing vocabulary. Of course, it also may have to do with just the complexity of English, in that it has words with subtle meaning differences. You know, often learners have to learn the word as part of its phrases or collocations, like football match, instead of saying football competition. A lot of things in this region, regardless of where you are, you know, we'll see people say, I need some blue color instead of blue paint, or send it to me at my home instead of my house, which would sound a little bit better. Looking at some adjectives, we notice that here the endings can cause a lot of confusion, especially with things of the ed and the ing endings. You know, for example, a thing is exciting while a person is excited. The thing goes for interested and interesting, bored and boring. You know, I remember going to one class of mine and just kind of waiting for something in the hallway. And the student walked by and said, "Teacher, you look boring." And I was like, oh gosh, they know already I'm going to be boring. Oh no. When really they meant to say, you know, "Teacher, you look bored." But these can be problems here in ASEAN. Now, when it comes to spelling, ASEAN actually does pretty well overall, as compared to the worldwide average. That's not to say that our spelling is perfect, as you can see here on the screen. These are among the top 25 words most frequently misspelled by ASEAN learners. You can see in the squares here. But spellings are always a big issue for learners of English. And of course, we have the differences between British and American variations, as well as other variants like Canadian or Australian English. And there are a lot of words spelled differently in American versus British English, and patterns have to be learned for this. Now, some of the most common errors include confusing with one O versus two with two for two. So TO versus TOO. Words like receive, which are even confusing for first language speakers, to be honest with you. Same with accommodation. They happen here as well. Also, the word picnic, where you can see here a lot of times in some of the languages spelled pinnick instead of picnic. And this here suggests that they're really guessing it based on how they pronounce the word. You know, when we say picnic, the C kind of contracts and maybe they don't hear it. So they're basing the pronunciation or the spelling on pronunciation, which can be good, but we need to be aware of that. Another tricky cause of errors is clusters of duplicated consonants, things like tomorrow, TOMORROW, and again, the dreaded accommodation, ACCOMODATION. Although, again, that's one that when I write, spell check underlines with the red line for me as well. It's just one of those mental blocks I have. So again, the point is spelling is difficult even for quote unquote first language English speakers or native English speakers. But while we do have problems in ASEAN, we're actually doing better than the rest of the world. Now, one of the big questions, or one of the things that I think that's important to point out, is to look at, are our learners so different? And you can see here it kind of says no. Well, we've looked at what our learners are good at, and we've looked at in which ways they need more support. And it's easy to feel that our situation is so unique and so different. You know, when I go around and do teacher training around the region, you know, I can hear people say, oh, Alan, you know, maybe that works in Thailand, but this is Vietnam. Oh, but this is Indonesia. Oh, but this is Singapore. You know, oh, look, yes, there are some things that we've seen that are unique to the learners and based on some of the influence of our first language. But actually, how different are our learners to learners around other learners around the region and even learners around the world? They're actually pretty similar, especially if we look at the broader types of things they find difficult rather than the picky particular instances. Let me give you an example. These are the error types that we see in Southeast Asian learners most often. I want you to have a look. And I want you to think to yourself, which of these do you think are problems for other languages around the world? Which do you think would be problems for, like, say, Spanish speakers or Arabic speakers? Which ones do you think are special for ASEAN? Which ones do you think are universal? If you want to go ahead and write in the comments what you think, that would be fun. Well, the answer is all of them. They may appear in different order around the world, but these 10 error types, which we see in ASEAN learners most often, also feature in the top 20 errors made by learners everywhere. And why? Why is that? Well, it's because, look, while we said English has some advantages and English can be easier, just because something is easier doesn't mean it's easy. It's often considered easier to start learning English. And it can be grammatically more simple than a lot of other languages, but we need to admit that English is difficult. English can be hard for a lot of learners across the world. Firstly, its spelling is complicated and hard to predict. You can see here, the words are not written as they are pronounced. Look at this O-U-G-H, and how these can be pronounced in so many different ways. Though, through, thorough, it's enough to make you go, woo, crazy. Some patterns can be learned. For example, saying I before E, except after C, with the exception of neighbor. But then again, there's always going to be exceptions to these, even if we learn the patterns. We'll come back to spelling errors in a moment. Another problem of English is its large vocabulary. And this means that learners may be confronted with new words and phrases, often with similar meanings and subtle differences that maybe they're just not used to getting the different senses of. For example, handle versus manage versus deal with. Of course, English is spoken in many countries, so it has lots of regional variations and dialects, and these may have different ways of saying the same thing. One of the toughest parts of English grammar can be the simple word the, since it is frequently used but often hard to predict, especially for languages which don't have similar definite articles. And that's true of so many of the languages here in Southeast Asia. For some learners, English sounds can be hard to pronounce, such as the two th sounds, th and th. The English R sound, which gives us problems for different reasons around the region. In Thailand, for example, R and L can be interchanged. The word r and l can be the same in Thailand. When we look at Indonesia, and especially like when I go to Java, I love to have people tell me I'm right, because they don't tell me I'm correct. They say I'm correct, and you hear the trill, and the R is an R, but it's a r, it's a trilled R. So even our English R sounds depend on the region, but it can be a problem around. And also diphthongs can be a problem. So by diphthongs, those things that combine two sounds like O or E, those can give us problems. So that's a little bit about what corpus data can tell us. But what can we do with it? It's interesting, but how do we apply it? Well, we use the Cambridge Learner Corpus to inform all of our course books. Sometimes, like in this example, it appears on the page. We know that common learner errors can become fossilized. They can stick. They can become almost permanent if not addressed early on in the learning process. And so the accuracy check, which is found in each unit of Evolve, for example, highlights common learner errors for that level, as found in the Cambridge Learner Corpus. And this helps students avoid these errors by having them notice them and to be conscious of it and try to avoid them in their speaking and writing. But actually, Insights from the Learner Corpus are throughout all of our learning materials, whether it has the specific thing on the page or not. See, we use the Learner Corpus to inform our curriculum. We use it to inform our vocabulary choices, the grammar choices. We want to make sure that we're teaching the right thing at the right time for our learners, and we use the corpus to make sure that that can happen. Just another example here, we can see how information on the types of errors students make, in this case, one we talked about, like with prepositions, can make it onto the page. And this can support students. So that's how we use it at Cambridge with our materials. But what can you do? How can you use corpus-informed approaches in your teaching? Well, that's a big question. And I don't have lots of time. In fact, I'm nearly out of time to discuss it today. So I would really recommend watching this talk. It's part of this same Insights on Demand series that we're doing at Cambridge University Press. It's free. But please watch Dr. Niall Curry's talk, because he's going to share some useful tools that you can work with to use corpora yourself, and some guidelines to help you get started if this is something that is interesting for you. And make sure you check out our other talks on corpus linguistics too, as part of an event on areas like spoken English or language change or English as a medium of learning and instruction. And so basically, that's it. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And if you have any further questions or comments that we haven't addressed, either in the chat box that you've had or the comment thread, please head over to this Padlet and leave your question there. We will be checking this Padlet. It's at https://padlet.com/cupelt/insights-on-demand. You can ask your questions or leave your comments there, and I promise you we'll have a look at them. So that is pretty much it on what we wanted to share with you about ASEAN learners and how it stacks up today. Again, I want to thank you for giving me your time, and I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of Insights on Demand. Have a great day, everyone.